I want to welcome you to this presentation on digital therapeutics. During the past year, our health innovation think tank has been discussing innovation in healthcare. We have found pockets of innovation that we believe will spread to other organizations and to other parts of the country. Some recent presentations on our conference calls have included, and that'd be on the next slide, Barry, perspectives from Silicon Valley, employer-sponsored health centers, telepsychiatry, and Zoom Care, which is located in Portland, Oregon. Today, our presentation is on digital therapeutics, or software as a drug. Although this is a new topic to many of us, I expect we will hear much more about it. In the future, doctors will be able to prescribe digital therapeutics that engage people in healthier behaviors and lifestyles. Digital therapeutics will enable us to shift from providing sick care to promoting better health. I am very pleased to be able to introduce Mary Giannini. After receiving her master's degree, on the next slide, Barry, in health services management, Mary went on to law school. For over 30 years, Mary has practiced health law in Spokane, Washington, and she is now working with medication review to manage prescriptions for over 30 hospitals. Mary serves on the board of Frontier Behavioral Health and is very interested in telepharmacy. Mary, please share with us your perspectives on digital therapeutics.
Thank you, Bruce. I will. I am especially interested in the world of telehealth and telepharmacy because, as Bruce said, my company, Medication Review, provides telepharmacy and pharmacy management, remote order entry to more than 30 hospitals in Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Alaska. And it's clearly a benefit to small hospitals and to some larger hospitals too, who don't have access to full-time pharmacy and need a technological support system to provide their services. So as I've had that interest, I was particularly interested in the concept of digital therapeutics, which I didn't know anything at all about until Bruce brought it to my attention fairly recently in preparation for this program. So next slide, Barry, let's talk about what digital therapeutics actually is. It's a subset of digital health, which is, as we probably all know, the convergence of digital and genomic revolutions in healthcare that happen online, technologically, to do all kinds of things, and in particular in our healthcare system. Digital therapeutics is a subset of digital health, and this is a Wikipedia definition. There are probably more complex definitions, but Wikipedia defines digital therapeutics as a health discipline and a treatment option that utilizes digital and online technologies to actually address and treat a medical and psychological condition. The treatment often, but not always, relies on behavioral and lifestyle changes that are typically spurred by digital impetuses. Now, that's a lot of words, but we're going to talk a little more later about some of the digital therapeutics applications that are out there, many of which are just coming into the market. It was interesting, as I was coming to work this morning, I happened to tune in to a national public radio program on my local NPR station, public radio, and it was called The Future of Mental Health Therapy, and the focus was digitized therapy. That was a real surprise to me because people are actually talking about that, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later too. Going on to the next slide. Several articles that I've read recently, one of them by Goldman Sachs, another by a company called Silos, which does technological healthcare outlook data collection, has an article that talks about digital therapeutics, and one of the technology developers talks about software as a drug. President and CEO Corey McCann, he's the president of a company called Pear Therapeutics that we'll talk about a little bit more. He says, we're not talking about telemedicine. This isn't just the interface between a patient and a physician, as telemedicine typically is. This is using digital therapeutics, using software as a drug, a treatment modality that actually plays a role in the patient's treatment and isn't merely a contact with the patient and by a patient with a provider or by a provider. So really we're talking about programs, applications that behave like drugs or medical devices in the ongoing treatment of a patient. So next slide, please. Here, out of a Goldman Sachs report, which was actually a report of the kind of technological innovation that's going on supported by venture capital, Goldman Sachs reports on 3 major categories of digital health-focused activities. And we're focusing today primarily on the first one, which is remote patient diagnostics and monitoring. Those are devices and apps that allow healthcare providers to engage with, interact with, and keep tabs on patients. For example, wearable patches that diagnose heart disease, glucose monitors for diabetes treatment, and interactive applications that engage patients who are in some kind of counseling for alcohol or drug addiction or for other mental health issues. There's also, and this is where most of us have probably had contact, telehealth, doctor and provider access and advice outside the venue of an office visit, such as telemedicine functions, clinical counseling, online diagnosis of issues like dermatology problems and the like. We're not going to talk so much about that today because there's a lot of information out there, and this is a new area. The digital therapeutics is separate and apart from telehealth. And then behavior modification, and these have been around for a while now in terms of applications like Fitbit that allow patients to monitor allow people to monitor their activities and to perhaps develop new lifestyle patterns in order to improve their health. Many of those wearable technologies are now being incorporated into applications that actually allow patients to change habits, adopt healthier lifestyles, prevent diseases, by using these digital programs for coaching. Next slide, please. Barry? Oh, thank you. Okay. There's also a 4th category that Goldman Sachs and Silos both have talked about, which is really kind of a support function for treatment and diagnosis, and that is data gathering and data management functions that support activities by insurance companies, by wellness programs run by employers that allow both the insurance companies and the employers to actually monitor the success of employee interactions with the healthcare system. Next page, next slide, please. So here are some examples that I came across in several articles. I selected these mostly just because they were interesting, because a number of them are already advanced into the healthcare system, and they address problems that are not only common in society, but also typically very expensive in terms of the amount of money that's being spent in our healthcare system on these issues. So the first one is by a company called TellCare out of Concord, Massachusetts, which has developed an application that has a cellular connection to a cell phone that can actually monitor blood glucose and then provide that information to a physician who can analyze the data and then respond to the patient with individualized messages based on the unique results of the patient's blood testing. The doctor can also send messages in addition to the response to the blood glucose monitoring, and the monitoring is ongoing. And the next one is Care Therapeutics, and Whoops, I'm sorry, not next slide, next company. If you could go back one slide, Barry, thank you. Care Therapeutics is developing products which manage substance abuse disorders by digitally connecting data on medication compliance, abstinence from alcohol and drugs, compliance with treatment, and the like, and they provide follow-ups to therapy providers. They also do interventions based on the therapist's analysis of the information that's collected. Care Therapeutics is also developing products for treatment of schizophrenia, chronic pain, PTSD, depression, and insomnia. And just as a note, in a recent study by the Healthcare Financial Management Association, they published a list of the 10 most expensive by insurance claims healthcare problems in the United States, and the top one is mental health issues. So one of the things that these kinds of applications directed towards mental health and abuse addiction is really focused on healthcare, bending the healthcare curve, hopefully lowering the cost of treatment. The program that I listened to this morning on NPR actually made some comments about that. The on-point interviewer was talking to 3 people who provide mental health services, and one of them had actually tried out an application called Talkspace, and he was actually using it on a subway, and it was an application that was a text message-based therapy platform that, as he put it, either replaces or at least supplements trips to a therapist. What was interesting was that there was also a therapist on the line who was a little bit more skeptical about the application than the person who had tried the application, who was a science reporter at one of the business publications. He pointed out that you have to be very careful not to try to supplement too much in-person therapy with these kinds of application-based therapies, but he admitted that there was a lot of potential for this kind of program. Next slide, please. NeuroTrack in Redwood City, California is currently seeking approval for a webcam-based monitoring system that detects early signs of cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's, years before typical symptoms arise. And I mean, obviously, the care of patients with dementia is also an incredibly expensive process. Slowing down decline is a major focus in the kind of diagnosis and treatment that's being done. And this kind of program is really focused on that early diagnosis, identifying early signs of decline so that they can be treated early. Propeller Health in Madison, Wisconsin is seeking approval for artificial intelligence powered inhalers for asthma and COPD patients. It would also be used in conjunction with a smartphone app so that patients who have symptoms will have an alert sent to their physician or another healthcare provider, which can help them monitor, manage their attacks, and sometimes even prevent asthma and COPD attacks. And then there's Alkili Interactive Labs out of Boston, Massachusetts, that has developed a function that monitors the brain's executive function and also uses prescribed games on the patient's smartphone, tablet, or laptop to engage the brain and hopefully ameliorate or even eliminate some of the symptoms of cognitive decline. So it's interesting, just going over the 3 or 4 applications that I've just talked about, that they're focused on some of the most expensive and difficult to manage healthcare problems that patients right now are having, chronic diseases, which are really expensive to the system. So next slide, please. Here are a couple of examples of the kind of data management support programs that are also being developed. company called HealthMine in Dallas, Texas, is working behind the scenes at insurance companies to gather information on participants in insurance company plans and also in employer support wellness programs. And this application will analyze health claims, prescriptions, and lab results, and even track Fitbit or Apple Health Kit data that the patient or the employee or participant collects via some kind of monitor. It seeks patterns and irregularities and can then send personalized recommendations to patients. It actually creates like a FICO credit score for health that patients can use, or employees and participants can use, for ongoing prevention. And one of the points that the HealthMine CEO makes in this article I read was, in what universe are any of us able to get better if we're not measuring something? You can't manage what you can't measure. And so the key to the function that they're talking about here is being able to measure data and accomplishments in the programs that are really meant to help prevent or treat problems. HealthMine reported that in the data that they collected for wellness programs and insurance companies, there was a measurable increase in preventive visits with members who are actually taking action to control their unhealthy conditions, that these members used the hospital less, significantly less, 10 to 20% fewer hospital admissions, bed days, and ER visits among the participants whose data was being collected. And then during the 3-year period that the data was measured, there were significant participation by participants in annual wellness exams as follow-ups to the kind of information that they were provided by HealthMine. They also identified some significant health problems. And then Canary Health in Los Angeles, California, is also a company that relies on data to analyze behavior-focused health around weight loss, pain reduction, lowered stress levels, and chronic disease prevention. And again, these are the kind of supports that both insurance companies and employer wellness programs have been depending on to improve the benefits that they're providing and reduce the cost. So next slide, please. We have one more example. It's Omada Health in San Francisco, California, which provides a 15-week online education program for pre-diabetes patients, hopefully to prevent the ongoing development of diabetes. The software online is combined with personal health coaching, support groups, and ongoing education. And it was interesting, again, in the program that I listened to this morning, that was one of the things the psychiatrist who was participating in the conference highlighted, was the importance of coordinating the use of these applications with real-time consultation with physicians or counselors, and in many cases, support groups and ongoing education. So I think one lesson that is already being learned with the use of these digital therapeutics is the importance of using them in coordination with and in conjunction with actual healthcare providers and provision of services. So next slide. The articles that I read talk about some of the factors that are really increasing the success of digital therapeutics use and development. And it should be pointed out that at this point, the digital therapeutics market, which is still a very small market, somewhere around a little less than a $1 billion market, which is small by comparison with a lot of other ventures, is poised to become about a $5 billion market in the next few years. This is based on Goldman Sachs' report of the kind of venture capital that is out there potentially coming into these kinds of therapeutic function activities. And the things that are really driving that kind of money, number one, probably the most obvious one, is continually rising health costs with an aging population, there's more and more incentive by employers, by insurance companies, even by providers of services to manage the cost of healthcare. And the potential for these kinds of supplemental and in some cases primary provisions of the services to patients can significantly reduce cost in the context, as everybody warns, of ongoing real-time treatment by providers who really understand the patient's problems. The second issue, shift towards a value-based payment mechanism. Again, the value of a treatment or a course of treatment or a diagnosis-related follow-through is not, it's based on the actual value of that service to the patient and not on the fact that it's just one of a number of services a physician or other provider is offering. That kind of value-based payment measurement is significant to things like the Health Mine and the Canary activities that are collecting information that actually shows that there's some benefit to using these kinds of programs that people are participating in. Third, employers encouraging health management. That's a huge issue because employers currently are offering wellness programs that only reach about 5% of the employee population. And there's a huge potential for growth there. Employers have a real incentive to do that kind of thing. As long as they're responsible for providing health insurance, they're also interested in being able to manage the cost of that insurance. A fourth issue, increasing consumerism in healthcare. People are more and more activist about their healthcare, partly because of the economics of cost sharing with deductibles and copays, and increasing payment obligations, but also because people are more knowledgeable about and more concerned about their healthcare and the kinds of things they can do to prevent problems or to mediate problems that they already have. Admittedly, people sometimes get information from the internet, from other sources that isn't always accurate, but hopefully the development of these kinds of applications will help focus people on information that really is more evidence-based, that is reviewed by providers and has some validity because it's been shown to be so. Next slide, please. A couple more factors. The fact that smartphones are ubiquitous. Virtually everybody has some kind of phone, and more of them are smartphones. People have other portable devices like laptops and tablets that make it much easier to use and much more appealing to use these kinds of applications. And then finally, the issue that Silos and Goldman Sachs both point out in their articles is that there's a substantial increase in the kind of money that's coming in from venture capitalists to investigate digital health. Along with telemedicine and telehealth, digital therapeutics products have really garnered substantial increased funding. The large healthcare companies like Merck, McKesson, Amgen, even the large technology companies like Samsung, Apple, Google have also gotten involved in developing these kinds of programs. So next slide, please. There are naturally potential barriers to continued growth. The most obvious one from going over some of this material we've just talked about is coming up with conclusive data that actually shows that these programs are effective. I think everybody knows that when, for example, Fitbit came out, everybody had a Fitbit and everybody was fixated on keeping track of their steps and whatever else Fitbit could keep track of. Over time, there appears to be less and less engagement by people in doing that kind of thing. And that may just be, the result of it not being as novel anymore, not being as fun to do, and people have just lost interest. But it's important in putting significant effort into these kinds of applications that not only do people continue to use them, but they see the value of them because they actually accomplish something. The second area, regulatory barriers. One of the participants on the phone call this morning, or the NPR program this morning, commented that currently companies that are submitting these digital therapeutics applications to the Federal Drug Administration and to the other government reviewing agencies are facing potentially 10 to 15 years for an approval process, which is totally unrealistic. There's no way that a process like that can be efficient in the world of the fast-moving world of digital therapeutics and the constant change that's happening. And yet, because these appear to be applications that may be significant for diagnosis and treatment, they do fall under the review of an agency like the FDA because of, health concerns. So just addressing the regulatory barriers, looking at ways to change those, is a significant issue. Consistent adoption by consumers. It's the same issue as wearables initially had. People would adopt them quickly, but then lose interest in them. They would use a bunch of different applications or wearables that conflicted with each other sometimes. And the same potential problems could occur with applications. People may pick and choose applications based on random reasons that don't necessarily mean that they're getting coordinated and valuable information. And without the monitoring of a healthcare provider, they may not even just be useless, they could be detrimental to someone's health. And that leads to the next issue, acceptance by physicians and other healthcare providers. There has to be buy-in by physicians and other healthcare providers such as counselors in order for these applications to actually work. None of them are intended to stand alone, and if they are, they may not be the best kind of application for people to actually be using. The fifth issue, not surprising at all, is reimbursement. Insurance companies and other payers have been slow to adopt payment mechanisms for digitally based activities, telemedicine being a classic example, but that's coming slowly, particularly as it becomes more and more obvious that they're beneficial. And finally, privacy and security concerns. These are primarily legal issues, the issue of whether information on these applications can be hacked, whether they can be protected appropriately, whether confidentiality can be maintained in interactions between essentially a digital patient and a provider who is using the information that is being monitored. Next slide. So the future of digital therapeutics looks bright, given the concerns that have been expressed and will continue to be expressed. They really do have the potential to allow people to engage actively in their own health status and their own health care. They potentially can save significant amounts of money. They also have potential to make some investors and some developers a significant amount of money too, because there's essentially an unlimited audience for this kind of activity, assuming the barriers that stand can be addressed. So I think this is an interesting area to keep track of, and I hope that we can continue to do so. Thank you.
Mary, thank you very much for your presentation. That was very informative. You've covered a lot of ground there. Although this is a new term really for both of us, you and me, digital therapeutics or software as a drug, I'm sure you'd agree we're going to hear much more about it, particularly with some of the projected growth numbers that you threw out, from 1 billion to 5 billion in the next few years. To wrap this up, we do conduct these conference calls on a regular basis for our health information think tank group. And for this particular presentation, my name is Bruce Korus. My information was on the front slide. And if you do have any questions, I'd appreciate if you just send me an email. My email is bwkorus@gmail.com. Again, thank you very much, Mary, for your presentation today.